Could the dream come true and Sony actually sell the rights to Spider-Man back to Disney and Marvel Studios? Well, this is something many of us fans have wanted for a long time, and recently a rumor started circulating that this could happen in the wake of the disaster that was Kraven the Hunter. Now, there's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to this story, so we're going to dive into where the rumor comes from, the pros and cons of why Sony might or might not do this, will Marvel even want it, and what they actually have to sell, because it's not as much as many people think. So let's take a couple minutes to dive into all the Spider-Man nonsense. Well, in the wake of Sony Studios' complete flop in the form of Kraven the Hunter, I keep hearing from most of you guys that basically what fans want is for Sony to either give the rights back to Marvel, sell the rights back to Marvel, or to let Marvel manage the rights and just make the movies themselves. Now, I want to be clear, this is a rumor, and one that pops up every time Sony kind of drops a turd and starts to lose a lot of money. So I want to take it with a massive grain of salt, but it is an interesting conversation and something many people have talked about for a long time. Now, this particular rumor comes from scooper My Time to Shine Hello, and at best, My Time to Shine Hello has a mixed track record, and honestly guys, in recent months it's gotten a lot worse. So I don't know if this is an actual true scoop or just something that scores well with SEO and fans and something people will latch onto and talk about. When it comes to the rights, Sony holds the rights to the live-action Spider-Man films, and interestingly, any character introduced in Spider-Man comics. This is how they got the rights to Null. The character of Null was created after the rights to Spider-Man were licensed to Sony Pictures. Actually, technically they were licensed to Columbia and then Sony bought Columbia, but we'll get to that in a second. Now, the character of Null is an offshoot of Venom, and Venom is definitely an offshoot of Spider-Man. So basically, if a character appeared for the very first time in Spider-Man comics or is part of the greater Spider-Man family, well, Sony holds the live-action film rights to that character. Now, in addition to that, Sony owns a portion of the Spider-Man merchandise rights, and that in itself is very, very lucrative. Spider-Man is one of the best-selling merchandise characters in the world, and this is probably the most valuable piece of everything that Sony holds, but way back when the first Amazing Spider-Man film came out, Disney and Marvel got a much bigger chunk of that, so it's not even a majority of that money. Now, after The Amazing Spider-Man 2 didn't do so well, Sony got hacked. Well, they basically went back to the drawing board and teamed up with Marvel Studios for the Tom Holland version of the character. Now, while all this was going on, Sony envisioned a Spider-Man cinematic universe, but its execution has been an absolute disaster, really probably minus that first Venom movie. Now, let's be fair, that first Venom movie was an absolute solid start, but each project after that pretty much has done worse and worse, and projects outside of the Venom franchise have pretty much universally flopped. Morbius, Madam Web, and Kraven are some of the worst box office performances for any Marvel movie ever. And these poor box office results really do highlight issues with Sony's handling of Marvel characters and probably undermine their confidence in this villain-centric universe, which we are hearing is going away. Additionally, these rights aren't free. Sony pays an annual fee, so underperformance can be quite costly and create additional red ink. When a movie goes into production and loses money, that costs them money. But then on top of that, they have to pay for using those characters, which costs them even more. Now, when it comes to selling the rights back to Marvel, we want to talk about this from an informed perspective. Now remember, Sony doesn't own the rights. Sony owns an exclusive license to the rights, and these are distinctively different. And that's something you should keep in mind with all of these details. Now, Sony has had some big success. The Spider-Verse films have brought in about $1 billion in just 2 films, and they've been pretty great. Along with that, they have that Amazon deal which is bringing Spider-Man Noir to life, and this is basically risk-free income for Sony Studios, who just farms it out to Amazon, lets them do the work, and just collects some money. And then finally, there's the MCU Spider-Man films, which have been highly profitable and massive returns for Sony, even though they have to share part of those profits with Marvel Studios proper. As a matter of fact, No Way Home is the highest grossing Sony movie ever. So there are a lot of good reasons that Sony doesn't get rid of the Spider-Man rights. Now, interestingly, it's unclear to me whether they can actually sell them to anybody else anyway. Way back when Tom Holland became Spider-Man, many of you might remember, that followed a Sony hack which exposed a lot of internal details. Now, one of those internal details that came out was the fact that Sony does have this exclusive license to Spider-Man, but it's non-transferable. Now, this is just like when you get a license from Microsoft. You know, when you get a Microsoft Windows license, that's your license to use, but you cannot sell that license to anybody else. And that's part of the terms of service. When Marvel sold the rights to Spider-Man to Columbia, not Sony, the Sony deal was actually in the works at that time, and the contract itself specified that the rights were non-transferable except transferable to Sony due to the pending sale. So these rights really effectively are not for sale and can't be sold to anybody else. Additionally, if Sony were to sell off Columbia, it's very unclear whether those Spider-Man rights would stay with Columbia Pictures or automatically revert back to Marvel, meaning if Sony's intending on selling them, well, that could be a signal they're ready to get rid of Columbia Pictures altogether. Now, one thing to keep in mind though when it comes to Sony is their Spider-Man games, and these rights are completely unaffected. Marvel has all the rights to the Spider-Man games, and Sony actually pays licensing fees just like any developer in the world. So those of you who are very worried about Sony losing the Spider-Man rights because of video games, well, that's really not something that's likely to happen. Now, this begs a lot of questions on how Marvel would handle this. Marvel already benefits from the current deal. They have Spider-Man in the MCU, they have massive merchandise rights, and the film profits for pretty much anything that Spider-Man appears in is pretty high. Sony doesn't get very much money at all when Spider-Man appears in other projects like Avengers films, but they do basically serve as the best commercial ever for the Spider-Man films. Buying the rights back would include full control of the Spider-Man films, but it would definitely cost Marvel a pretty penny, and it has its own associated risks. Additionally, there could be some huge obstacles in the way if this is happening. Sony could set a very high asking price to compensate for all their losses in recent years and future revenue potential. And Marvel just simply might not see enough value in paying Sony if they want a very steep price. Additionally, Sony's current financial success with those animated movies and the MCU's collaboration might make selling the rights less appealing when it comes to cost. Now, as far as final thoughts go, while Sony might entertain the idea of selling due to live-action failures, quite honestly, the financial and strategic benefits of retaining the rights will likely outweigh any incentive to sell, and this will probably prove to just be a rumor. Sony would make much more money to basically renegotiate the current deal that they have for the MCU, farm all of their Spider-Man rights directly back to Marvel with expectations of a certain number of films being made with a certain frequency, and then, like their Amazon deal, just sit back and collect money with no investment on their part. Spider-Man is going to remain one of the biggest characters in the world, and the MCU has not tapped into Miles Morales yet, who is likely to be massive in his first live-action outing. When people say sell the rights back to Marvel, it's super unclear whether Sony can even do that or why they would, but it is a giant geek wish that makes the rounds every time Sony falls flat on their face, and I suspect once again that's why it's making the rounds now. So what do you guys think? So do you think Sony should sell those Spider-Man movie rights back to Marvel Studios, or is the current approach salvageable and their best path forward is to work with Marvel Studios but maintain control of these rights so they can do what they want in the future? Honestly, it would be a dumb business decision on their part to sell it when they can just basically farm it out for money, but you never know, it's Sony and they are historically known for making terrible decisions. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Now, before you take off, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, ring that bell for all the updates, and make sure you get every notification because we do daily Marvel and DC content and we don't want you to miss any news.